At the funeral, my uncle told everyone he would inherit Grandpa's estate because he was the favorite grandson. What they didn't know was that Grandpa changed his will and left everything to me. So, I quietly let the lawyer read the real will in front of everyone. What happened next was absolutely priceless. My Uncle Richard stood at the front of the funeral home, one hand resting on my grandfather's casket like he owned it, the other gesturing broadly as he addressed the crowd of about 80 mourners. His voice carried that practiced tone of grief mixed with authority, the kind politicians use when they're pretending to care. Pop always said I was like a son to him, he announced, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. He told me just last month that everything he built, the house, the business, the land, it would all go to someone who understood his vision, someone who appreciated what he worked for. He paused for effect, letting his gaze sweep across the room before landing on me in the back row. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Someone worthy of carrying on his legacy. I sat there in my off-the-rack black suit, the one I'd bought at Men's Warehouse 2 years ago for job interviews, and said nothing. My hands were folded in my lap, my expression neutral. Around me, relatives nodded solemnly. Aunt Patricia, Richard's wife, was already crying theatrical tears into a tissue. Their daughter Vanessa, 23, and fresh out of her third attempt at college, looked appropriately somber while scrolling through Instagram on her phone. My own mother sat 3 rows ahead, her shoulders tense, but she didn't turn around. She hadn't looked at me since we'd arrived. Richard continued his eulogy, weaving in carefully placed hints about his close relationship with Grandpa, about the countless weekends he'd spent at the old farmhouse, about the business advice they'd shared. Every word was calculated. Every pause was deliberate. He was building a narrative, and everyone in that room was buying it. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known because I'd kept my mouth shut for 6 months, was that my grandfather had changed his will 14 weeks before he died. And the person sitting in the lawyer's office with those documents, watching this performance with the same quiet attention I was giving it, would be reading that will out loud in approximately 90 minutes. I'd been my grandfather's closest companion for the last 3 years of his life, but I'd learned early that in my family, showing up quietly counted for nothing when Richard showed up loudly. So I'd stayed quiet, visited Grandpa every Wednesday and Sunday like clockwork, listened to his stories, helped him with his medication, drove him to doctor appointments, and never once mentioned it at family gatherings. Why would I? Richard made sure everyone knew about his monthly phone calls and his annual Christmas visit. That seemed to be enough for everyone to decide who deserved what. The whole thing started on a Sunday morning in March, 3 years before Grandpa died. I'd graduated from state college with a degree in accounting, moved back to town, and was working at a small firm downtown, living in a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant below it. I had no real plans that Sunday, just laundry and maybe a hike, when my phone rang at 8 in the morning. It was Grandpa. His voice sounded thin, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "Nathan," he said, using my full name instead of Nate. "I fell yesterday. I'm okay. I'm fine. But I can't quite reach the bottles on the top shelf anymore. Would you mind coming by and reorganizing my kitchen?" I was in my car 20 minutes later, still in sweatpants, driving the 35 minutes out to his farmhouse on Miller Road. When I got there, I found him sitting at his kitchen table, his right wrist wrapped in an ace bandage, 3 bottles of prescription medication lined up in front of him, and an expression on his face that I'd never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine fear that his body was betraying him. I spent that Sunday reorganizing his entire kitchen, moving frequently used items to lower shelves, installing a step stool near the counter, labeling his medications with large print stickers that listed the dosage times. While I worked, Grandpa sat at the table and told me stories about building the farmhouse in 1968, about my grandmother who died when I was 7, about the carpentry business he'd run for 40 years. "Your Uncle Richard called yesterday," he mentioned casually. "I told him about the fall. He said he'd try to visit next month." Next month. I didn't say anything, just nodded and kept organizing. When I finished, Grandpa looked around his kitchen with relief visible on his face. "You're a good kid, Nathan," he said. "You've always been a good kid. Quiet, but good." I told him it was nothing, that I'd come back next weekend if he needed anything else. "Next Sunday?" he asked. "If you're not too busy?" I wasn't busy. I hadn't been busy in months. That became our routine without either of us explicitly planning it. Every Sunday at 10 in the morning, I'd drive out to the farmhouse. Sometimes we'd work on projects, fixing a loose board on the porch, cleaning out the gutters, organizing 50 years of accumulated tools in the barn. Other times we'd just sit and talk, him telling stories from his past, me listening and asking questions nobody else seemed interested in hearing answered. He told me about starting his carpentry business with $300 and a borrowed truck, about landing his first major contract to build cabinets for the new elementary school in 1971, about the year he'd almost gone bankrupt when a client refused to pay and he'd had to take out a second mortgage. "Richard doesn't know these stories," he said once. "He thinks the business just magically succeeded. He thinks money just appears when you want it." I'd met Richard maybe 15 times in my entire life, despite him being my father's older brother. He lived 6 hours away in Boston, worked in commercial real estate, drove a Mercedes, and visited exactly twice a year, Christmas and Grandpa's birthday in July. Those visits lasted approximately 4 hours each, just long enough for Richard to bring an expensive gift, take photos for social media, and make vague promises about spending more time together. After about 6 months of Sunday visits, Grandpa's doctor recommended he start physical therapy for his wrist and shoulder. The fall had done more damage than initially thought, and at 83, his body wasn't healing the way it used to. The physical therapy clinic was in town, 30 minutes from his farmhouse, and the appointments were scheduled for Wednesday mornings at 9. "I can drive myself," Grandpa insisted when the doctor first mentioned it. "You've got work. You're busy." I wasn't that busy. My boss, a man named Leonard Frost who'd run Frost & Associates accounting for 30 years, was flexible about hours as long as the work got done. I told Grandpa I'd pick him up at 8:15 every Wednesday. He protested twice more, then accepted with visible relief. So Wednesdays became physical therapy days. I'd pick him up, we'd go to his appointments, then we'd usually grab lunch at the diner on 5th Street, where Grandpa had been eating the same chicken salad sandwich for 20 years. Those lunches became the foundation of something I hadn't expected: actual friendship with my grandfather. He started telling me things during those Wednesday lunches that I don't think he'd told anyone else. About my grandmother, how they'd met at a county fair when she was 17 and he was 19, how he'd proposed after knowing her for exactly 3 months. About my father, his younger son, who died of a heart attack when I was 12. "Your dad was gentle," Grandpa said once, staring into his coffee. "Too gentle for Richard. Richard always thought gentle meant weak." He told me about building the farmhouse by hand over the course of 2 years, about every room and every board, about how my grandmother had insisted on specific windows in the kitchen so she could watch the sunrise. "Richard wants me to sell it," he mentioned during one of those lunches. "Says it's too much house for one old man. Says I should move into one of those senior communities where everything's taken care of." I asked what he wanted. Grandpa looked at me like nobody had asked him that question in years. "I want to die in the house I built," he said simply. "Is that so unreasonable?" The calls from Richard increased after Grandpa turned 84. Suddenly the monthly phone calls became weekly, each one filled with concern about Grandpa living alone, about the farmhouse being too isolated, about safety and practicality, and what made sense at his age. Grandpa would tell me about these conversations during our Wednesday lunches, his frustration barely concealed. "He keeps saying he's worried," Grandpa would say, "but what he's really worried about is the property value. He's already looked up comparable sales in the area. He mentioned the price per acre 3 times last call." The farmhouse sat on 82 acres of land that had been in our family since 1956. The property was worth approximately $1.4 million, according to the county assessor's website, a number I'd looked up one night out of curiosity. The carpentry business, though retired, still held value in equipment and the commercial property where the workshop stood. Grandpa's total estate was probably worth close to $2 million, maybe more. Richard knew this. Richard had always known this. I was there when Richard made his big visit, the one where he brought a senior living brochure and a real estate agent's card. It was a Saturday in October, 18 months after I'd started my Sunday visits. I'd come out that morning to help Grandpa plant bulbs for spring, and we were in the garden behind the house when Richard's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. He got out wearing designer jeans and a cable-knit sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his wife Patricia beside him in yoga pants and oversized sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Grandpa's whole demeanor changed. His shoulders tightened. His smile became fixed. "Richard," he called out, wiping dirt from his hands. "Didn't know you were coming." Richard's smile was broad and practiced. "Wanted to surprise you, Pop. Plus, Patricia and I were thinking about that conversation we had on the phone, about your living situation." Grandpa glanced at me. I was still kneeling in the dirt, bulbs scattered around me, very deliberately not part of this conversation. "Nathan's helping me with the garden," Grandpa said, like he needed to explain my presence. Richard looked at me for the first time, his expression briefly confused, like he was trying to remember who I was. "Nathan. Right. How are you?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning back to Grandpa. "Let's go inside and talk. I brought some information I think you'll find interesting." I stayed outside for the next 90 minutes, planting bulbs and listening to the muffled sound of conversation from inside the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see Richard gesturing animatedly, showing Grandpa papers and brochures. Patricia sat beside him, nodding supportively. Grandpa sat across from them, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When they finally emerged, Richard looked frustrated in that carefully controlled way people do when they're used to getting what they want and didn't. "Just think about it, Pop," he said as they walked to their car. "The community I showed you is top-rated. You'd have people around, activities, medical staff on site. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big property anymore." Grandpa's voice was quiet but firm. "I built this house, Richard. I'm not leaving it." Richard's smile tightened. "You're 84. You fell 6 months ago. What happens when you fall again and nobody's here?" I stood up from the garden, brushing dirt off my jeans. "I'm here twice a week," I said. Richard looked at me like I'd materialized out of thin air. "That's great, Nathan, really. But you've got your own life. You can't be expected to be on call for emergencies." I shrugged. "I don't mind." The look Richard gave me in that moment was pure calculation. He was reassessing me, trying to figure out if I was a problem or just a kid playing caretaker who'd get bored eventually. He decided on the latter. "Well," he said, his smile returning, "it's good Pop has family looking out for him, but long term, we need to think practically." He gave Grandpa a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds, promised to call next week, and drove away in his Mercedes. Grandpa and I stood in the driveway, watching the car disappear. "He means well," Grandpa said finally. "Does he?" I asked. Grandpa was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "No, he doesn't." We went back to planting bulbs. Neither of us mentioned Richard again that day, but something had shifted. Some unspoken understanding had formed between us. I wasn't just visiting anymore. I was standing between Grandpa and something he didn't want, something Richard very much did. 3 months later, Grandpa asked me to drive him to a lawyer's office in town. He said he needed to update some paperwork, nothing major, just routine estate planning stuff that he'd been putting off. The lawyer was a woman named Diane Thornton, who'd practiced family law in our county for 26 years, according to the plaque on her wall. She was maybe 60, with short gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every family drama possible and wasn't impressed by any of it. Grandpa introduced me as his grandson, the one who drove him to appointments. Diane shook my hand, offered me coffee, and suggested I wait in the lobby. I sat out there for 90 minutes reading 6-month-old copies of Time magazine while Grandpa and Diane talked behind closed doors. When they finally emerged, Grandpa looked lighter somehow, like he'd put down something heavy. "All set?" I asked. "All set," he confirmed. We drove home in comfortable silence. He didn't tell me what he'd discussed with Diane, and I didn't ask. It wasn't my business. The next year passed in the same rhythm. Sundays and Wednesdays, garden work and physical therapy appointments, lunches at the diner, and conversations about everything from carpentry techniques to politics to his memories of my father. Richard called every week, his concern growing more pointed each time. He started mentioning my name. "I heard Nathan's been visiting a lot," he said during one call that Grandpa put on speaker. "That's nice of him, but he's young. He shouldn't feel obligated to babysit you." Grandpa's jaw tightened. "He's not babysitting me, Richard. He's visiting. There's a difference." Richard laughed, that dismissive laugh people use when they think you're being naive. "I'm just saying, Pop, don't let him take advantage of your generosity. You know how young people are. They sense opportunity." The implication was clear. I was hanging around hoping for an inheritance. Never mind that I'd never asked Grandpa for a single dollar. Never mind that I paid for our lunches half the time. Never mind that I'd used my own money to buy him a new cell phone when his old flip phone died because I wanted to make sure he could call for help if he needed it. Richard had decided I was opportunistic, and nothing would change his mind. Grandpa got sick in February, 2 years and 10 months after my first Sunday visit. It started as a cough he couldn't shake, then became pneumonia, then became a hospital stay that turned into 2 weeks. I visited every day after work, sitting in the uncomfortable chairs they provide in hospital rooms, reading him the newspaper or just keeping him company while he slept. Richard called 3 times during those 2 weeks, but didn't visit. "I've got a major deal closing," he explained to Grandpa during one call. "I can't get away right now, but I'm thinking about you. Patricia's thinking about you. We're all worried." Grandpa told him not to worry, that he'd be fine. When he hung up, he looked at me. "He's not coming." It wasn't a question. "Probably not," I agreed. Grandpa nodded slowly. "But you're here." I was here. I'd been here. When Grandpa was discharged, the doctor, a young resident named Kevin Liu with excellent credentials from Johns Hopkins, pulled me aside. "Your grandfather's recovery is going well, but he needs monitoring. Someone should check on him daily for at least the next month. Is that something you can do?" I said yes, immediately. Dr. Liu nodded, made notes in his chart. "Good. He's lucky to have you." Daily visits meant I started keeping spare clothes at the farmhouse, meant I was there for breakfast some days and dinner other days, meant we watched the news together, played chess, talked about everything and nothing. Grandpa's health stabilized, then improved. By April, he was back to his normal self, puttering around the garden, working on small woodworking projects in his barn workshop. But something had changed during his hospital stay. He'd gotten quieter, more reflective. One Sunday afternoon, we were sitting on the porch, watching storm clouds gather over the fields, when he said, "I updated my will again last month." I looked at him. He was staring straight ahead, his expression neutral. "Okay," I said. "I want you to know something, Nathan. Richard's going to be angry. Patricia's going to be angry. There's going to be a scene." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Grandpa continued, "I built everything I have. The house, the business, the life. I get to decide what happens to it. And I've decided that it should go to someone who actually gave a damn about me as a person, not just as a bank account." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "You've been here, Nathan. Not because you had to be. Not because you wanted something. But because you actually care. That's rare. That's valuable. And that's what I want to reward." I felt my throat tighten. "Grandpa, you don't have to." He held up a hand. "I've already done it. It's done. I'm telling you now so you're not blindsided later. When I die, and I will die, probably sooner than later at my age, everything goes to you. The house, the land, the business assets, all of it. There's a small amount set aside for Richard, $20,000, because he's still my son, and I'm not completely cutting him out. But the bulk of it, about 95%, goes to you. I sat there on that porch, thunder rumbling in the distance, and tried to process what he'd just told me. Richard's going to lose his mind, I finally said. Grandpa smiled, a genuine smile that showed his remaining teeth. Probably, but that's his problem, not yours. The will is ironclad. Diane made sure of it. Richard can contest it if he wants, but he won't win. The documentation is too thorough. I asked what he meant by documentation. Grandpa explained that Diane had advised him to keep records of family interactions, to document who visited and who didn't, who helped and who just talked about helping. I've got 3 years of calendar entries, Grandpa said. Every Sunday visit, every Wednesday appointment, every phone call. Diane said if Richard tries to claim undue influence or diminished capacity, we've got evidence that I was clear-minded and that my decision was based on years of observation, not manipulation. I'd had no idea any of this was happening. No idea Grandpa was building a legal case for his own will. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Grandpa looked out at the storm rolling toward us. Because I'm 86 years old, Nathan. I could die tomorrow. I could die in 5 years. But whenever it happens, I want you to be prepared. Richard's not going to take this quietly. He's going to make accusations. He's going to try to paint you as someone who took advantage of an old man. I want you to know that when that happens, when he stands up at my funeral or wherever and starts his performance, you just stay quiet. Let Diane handle it. The truth is in the documents. Grandpa died on a Monday morning in September, 260 days after that conversation on the porch. I got the call at work from his neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, who had a key to the farmhouse and checked on him when she didn't see his lights on by 8 in the morning. He'd passed peacefully in his sleep, heart failure, exactly the way he'd always said he wanted to go. I left work immediately, drove to the farmhouse, met the paramedics and the coroner and Mrs. Kowalski, who was crying into a kitchen towel. The house felt wrong without Grandpa in it, too quiet, too still. I called Richard from Grandpa's kitchen phone, the landline he'd refused to get rid of. Richard answered on the 3rd ring. Pop? His voice was surprised. Grandpa never called him. It's Nathan, I said. I'm calling to let you know that Grandpa passed away this morning. Heart failure. Peaceful. There was a long silence. Then, I see. When? This morning. The coroner was here about an hour ago. Richard's voice shifted into efficiency mode. Okay, I'll make arrangements to come down. We'll need to discuss funeral planning, estate matters, all of that. I'll be there Thursday. Don't touch anything in the house until I get there. I almost laughed at that. Don't touch anything. Like I was a stranger, not the person who'd been there twice a week for 3 years. The funeral home needs to be contacted, I said instead. And there are people who need to be notified. Richard cut me off. I'll handle all of that. I'm the eldest son. This is my responsibility. He paused. Did Pop leave any instructions? Any documents I should know about? I thought about the will, sitting in Diane Thornton's office, waiting. I don't know, I said honestly. You'll have to check with his lawyer. Richard made a sound like he was making a note. Right. I'll take care of everything. You just sit tight. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood in Grandpa's kitchen, phone in hand, and felt the weight of what was coming settle over me like a blanket. Richard was going to take control. Richard was going to plan everything. And Richard was going to be in for the shock of his life when Diane Thornton read that will. Thursday came. Richard arrived with Patricia and Vanessa in tow, all of them dressed in expensive black like they were attending a fashion funeral. They swept into the farmhouse like they owned it, Richard immediately starting to direct operations. We'll have the service on Saturday, he announced to the room, which included me, Mrs. Kowalski, and 2 of Grandpa's old friends from his carpentry days. Donnelly Funeral Home, 2 p.m., reception afterward at the Riverside Community Center. I've already made the arrangements. I asked if he'd consulted anyone about what Grandpa would have wanted. Richard gave me a patient smile, the kind you give a child who's asked a stupid question. I knew Pop better than anyone, Nathan. I know what he would have wanted. Mrs. Kowalski, bless her, snorted. You knew him? You visited twice a year. Richard's smile hardened. I'm his son. That's a relationship that transcends frequency of visits. He turned back to me. Now, about the house. We'll need to get it appraised, start thinking about listing it. The market's good right now. I've already contacted a realtor. I stood there in the living room where I'd watched countless hours of television with Grandpa, where I'd helped him set up his DVD player so he could watch old westerns, where we'd played chess every Sunday afternoon. You're selling the house, I said slowly. Of course we're selling the house, Patricia chimed in. What else would we do with it? It's not like anyone's going to live here. Richard nodded agreement. The property alone is worth at least $1.2 million. The house probably adds another $200,000 in value. We'll clear at least $1.4 after fees and taxes. He said it so casually, like he was discussing stock prices, not dismantling the home Grandpa built with his own hands. Plus the business assets. Richard continued. The equipment, the commercial property, all told, we're looking at close to $2 million. Split between me and the estate beneficiaries, that's substantial. I noticed he said, me and the estate beneficiaries, like those were two different groups, like he'd already decided he was the primary heir. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday at 2 p.m., like Richard had decided. Friday was visitation, 6 to 9 p.m., at Donnelly Funeral Home on Cherry Street. I arrived at 5:30, before the doors officially opened, and found Richard already there, directing the funeral home staff on flower placement and photo arrangements. He'd created an entire display of photographs, most of them featuring himself and Grandpa. Christmas photos from when Richard was a child. Richard's college graduation with Grandpa in the background. Richard's wedding. Where are the recent photos? I asked, looking at the display. Richard frowned. These are the good ones, the ones that show Pop's life properly. The most recent photo in the entire display was from 7 years ago. Nothing from the last 3 years. Nothing from our Sunday visits or Wednesday appointments. Nothing that showed Grandpa as he actually was at the end of his life. Just old memories that supported Richard's narrative. I'd brought a small photo album with me, pictures I'd taken on my phone over the past 3 years and had printed at Walgreens. Grandpa in his garden, Grandpa at physical therapy, Grandpa at our Wednesday lunches, smiling over chicken salad. I set them on a side table. Richard noticed immediately. What are those? Just some photos, I said, from the last few years. Richard picked up one photo, examined it, set it back down. These are very casual. His tone made it clear that casual was not a compliment. They're real, I said. Richard's smile was condescending. They're not appropriate for a formal memorial. This is about honoring Pop's legacy, not documenting everyday mundane moments. He gathered my photos, handed them back to me. Maybe you can keep these for yourself, a personal memory. I took the photos back, but didn't leave. Instead, I placed them on the table again, in front of Richard's curated display. These show who he was, I said quietly. Not who you wanted him to be. Richard's expression hardened. We stood there, facing each other across the photo table, and I saw him reassess me again. I wasn't just the quiet nephew anymore. I was someone willing to push back. Nathan, he said, his voice taking on that patient, condescending tone. I understand you spent some time with Pop these last few years. That's commendable. Really. But I'm his son. I knew him for 60 years. You knew him for 3. There's a difference. Before I could respond, people started arriving for visitation. The next 3 hours were a blur of handshakes and condolences and stories from people who'd known Grandpa in various phases of his life. Multiple people mentioned that they'd heard Grandpa talk about me, about our Sunday visits. Mrs. Kowalski told anyone who would listen that I'd been there twice a week without fail. One of Grandpa's old friends, a man named George Prentice, who'd worked with him in the carpentry business for 30 years, pulled me aside. Your grandfather talked about you a lot, George said. Said you were the only one in the family who actually gave a damn. Said you reminded him of himself when he was young. I thanked him, feeling my throat tighten again. George continued, his voice lower. He also said his son Richard was a grade A jackass who only called when he wanted something. Said the only time Richard visited was when he was trying to convince him to sell this place. I glanced over at Richard, who was holding court near the casket, accepting condolences like a grieving son, his performance perfect. George followed my gaze. Watch yourself with that one, he said. Your grandpa knew what he was doing. He was sharper than people gave him credit for. Saturday arrived, the day of the funeral. I dressed in my Men's Warehouse suit, drove to Donnelly Funeral Home, and took my seat in the back row. The place filled up quickly, maybe 80 people total, all of them there to pay their respects to a man who'd been a fixture in the community for 60 years. Richard sat in the front row with Patricia and Vanessa, the grieving family, the primary mourners. I sat in the back and watched. The service was generic, perfectly pleasant, and utterly impersonal. The funeral director, a middle-aged man named Albert Donnelly, who'd probably given this exact speech 1,000 times, talked about Grandpa's life in broad strokes. Born in 1938, married in 1960, built a successful carpentry business, loved his family, all true, all surface level, all missing the actual person Grandpa had been. Then Richard stood up to give the eulogy, and the performance began. That's when he told everyone he was like a son to Grandpa, that everything would go to someone who understood his vision, someone worthy of carrying on his legacy. Every word was calculated to establish his position as the rightful heir. I watched faces in the crowd. Some people nodded along, believing Richard's narrative. Others looked uncomfortable, like they knew something was off, but couldn't quite name it. Mrs. Kowalski's expression was pure disgust. George Prentice shook his head slowly. But most people just accepted it because Richard was the son, and sons inherit. That's how it works. Richard wrapped up his eulogy with a carefully rehearsed emotional moment, his voice breaking at exactly the right time, his hand resting on the casket in a gesture of final goodbye. Then he returned to his seat, and the funeral director announced that we'd now move to the reception at Riverside Community Center, followed by a brief reading of the will at 3:30 p.m. for immediate family. The mention of the will caused a small stir in the crowd, people glancing at each other. You don't usually read wills at funerals, but apparently Richard had requested it, probably wanting to cement his inheritance publicly while everyone was gathered. The reception was held in a bland, multi-purpose room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting. There were sandwiches and coffee, and a general atmosphere of forced cheerfulness as people tried to celebrate Grandpa's life while also respecting that we were at a funeral. Richard worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, accepting condolences, telling stories about Grandpa that may or may not have been true. I stood near the coffee station, watching, waiting. At 3:25, the funeral director approached our group, immediate family, which consisted of Richard, Patricia, Vanessa, my mother, and me. "Ms. Thornton is ready for you in the conference room," he said, gesturing toward a hallway. We followed him to a small, windowless room with a table and 6 chairs. Diane Thornton was already there, sitting at the head of the table with a manila folder in front of her. She stood when we entered, shook hands with everyone, and introduced herself as Grandpa's attorney. Richard sat directly across from her, assuming the power position. Patricia sat beside him. Vanessa was scrolling through her phone. My mother took a seat near the wall, and I stood near the door, leaning against the wall, hands in my pockets. Diane opened her folder, pulled out a document, and set it on the table. "First, let me express my condolences to all of you. Mr. Morrison was a good man and a good client. He was very clear about his wishes, and it's my job to ensure those wishes are carried out." She paused. "The will was last updated on January 19th of this year, approximately 8 months ago. Mr. Morrison was of sound mind and body when he made these changes, and I have documentation attesting to his mental capacity at the time of signing." Richard leaned forward. "Of course he was of sound mind. There's no question about that." Diane gave him a professional smile. "I'm glad we agree. Now, the estate consists of the following assets. The farmhouse and 82 acres of land, currently valued at approximately $1.4 million. The commercial property housing the former Morrison Carpentry Workshop, valued at $200,000. Various equipment and tools, estimated value $50,000. And liquid assets including savings and investments totaling approximately $300,000. Total estate value is approximately $1.95 million. Richard's eyes lit up. He was doing math in his head, calculating his inheritance. Diane continued. "The will specifies that a sum of $20,000 be paid to Richard Morrison as a token of his father's affection and acknowledgement of their familial relationship." The room went silent. Richard's face slowly drained of color. "What?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Diane continued reading, her voice steady and professional. "The remainder of the estate, including all real property, business assets, and liquid assets, is to be transferred to Nathan Morrison, grandson of the deceased, in recognition of his devoted care and companionship during the final years of Mr. Morrison's life." She looked up from the document. "Nathan, that would be you." I stood against the wall, my hands still in my pockets, and said nothing. I'd known this was coming for months, but hearing it read out loud in front of Richard was surreal. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times. Then he exploded. "This is insane! Pop wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave everything to Nathan." His voice was rising, his face turning red. "He barely knew Nathan. I'm his son." Diane's expression didn't change. "Mr. Morrison was very explicit in his reasoning. The will includes a letter of explanation which I'm authorized to read if you'd like." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "Yes, I'd like. I'd like to hear how my father supposedly justified cutting me out of my inheritance." Diane pulled out another document, this one handwritten. "This is in Mr. Morrison's own hand, written the same day he updated the will and witnessed by myself and my paralegal, Amanda Stevens." She cleared her throat and began to read. "To whom it may concern, I am writing this to explain my final wishes and to prevent any confusion or contest after my death. I am of sound mind and body. I am not being coerced or influenced by anyone. These decisions are mine alone. I have 2 grandsons, Richard's daughter, Vanessa, who has visited me exactly 4 times in the past 10 years, and my son's boy, Nathan, who has been a constant presence in my life for the past 3 years. Nathan visits every Sunday and Wednesday without fail. He drives me to medical appointments. He helps maintain my home. He listens to my stories. He plays chess with me. He cares about me as a person, not as a source of inheritance. Richard, my eldest son, calls me once a week, but visits twice a year. His visits last approximately 4 hours and consist primarily of him suggesting I sell my home and move into a senior facility. He has looked up property values. He has consulted real estate agents. He has made it clear, though never explicitly stated, that he is waiting for me to die so he can liquidate my assets. I do not fault him for this. It is human nature to think about inheritance, but I do fault him for pretending to care about my well-being when he actually cares about his future financial gain. Nathan has never asked me for anything. Nathan has never mentioned my will or my assets. Nathan simply shows up, helps out, and keeps an old man company. That is worth more than any amount of money Richard could ever inherit." The room was dead silent. Richard's face had gone from red to pale to a sickly gray color. Diane continued reading. I am leaving Richard $20,000 as acknowledgement that he is my son and that I do not wish to completely disinherit him. I am leaving the bulk of my estate to Nathan because he has earned it through loyalty, companionship, and genuine care. If Richard wishes to contest this will, he is welcome to try. But I have documented every interaction, every visit, every phone call for the past 3 years. I have witnesses who can attest to Nathan's presence and Richard's absence. I have medical professionals who can testify to my mental capacity. This will is ironclad because my decision is based on 3 years of observation, not a momentary impulse. I hope Richard can accept this with grace, though I suspect he will not. Either way, my decision stands. Signed, Robert Morrison, January 19th, 2024. Diane set the letter down. That's the entirety of the explanation. As Mr. Morrison stated, this will is thoroughly documented and has been prepared to withstand any contest. Richard exploded out of his chair, pointing at me. You manipulated him. You isolated him from his family. You poisoned him against me. His voice was shaking with rage. That's elder abuse. I'm contesting this will. I'm getting lawyers. Diane's voice remained calm. Mr. Morrison, you're welcome to contest the will, but I should inform you that doing so will be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. Your father anticipated this reaction and took extensive precautions. She pulled out another folder. I have 3 years of calendar documentation showing every visit Nathan made and every phone call you made. I have testimony from neighbors, friends, and medical professionals about Nathan's involvement in your father's care. I have documentation of your attempts to convince your father to sell his home against his wishes. I have your father's own written testimony about his reasoning. And I have the recording. That stopped Richard mid-rant. Recording? Diane nodded. Your father recorded a video statement explaining his decision, dated January 19th, the same day he updated the will. It's 13 minutes long and covers his reasoning in detail. Would you like to see it? Richard collapsed back into his chair. Patricia was crying quietly into a tissue. Vanessa had stopped looking at her phone and was staring at her father like she'd never seen him before. My mother sat frozen, her eyes wide. I remained standing against the wall, watching Richard's world crumble in real time. This can't be happening, Richard whispered. This can't be real. Diane organized her papers with practiced efficiency. I understand this is difficult news, Mr. Morrison, but your father's wishes were clear and legally sound. The $20,000 will be transferred to your account within 30 days. Nathan will inherit the remainder of the estate as specified. If you choose to contest, that's your right, but I strongly advise against it. You'll spend more on legal fees than you'd ever recover, and the outcome is already determined. She stood up. I'm available if you have any legal questions about the probate process or your inheritance. Nathan, we should schedule a meeting to discuss the property transfer and estate management. I'm in my office Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. I nodded. I'll call you Monday morning. Diane gathered her documents, gave the room one final professional smile, and left. The silence she left behind was suffocating. Richard sat there, staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists. Patricia had stopped crying and was now looking at me with pure hatred. Vanessa had gone back to her phone, apparently deciding family drama wasn't as interesting as Instagram. My mother finally spoke. Nathan, is this true? Did you know about this? I looked at her. Grandpa told me 6 months ago, but I didn't ask for it. I didn't even expect it. Richard's head snapped up. You knew for 6 months? You knew and you didn't say anything? Because it wasn't mine to say, I responded. It was Grandpa's decision. His money. His choice. Richard stood up slowly. You manipulated him. I don't know how, but you did. You spent all that time with him. You isolated him. You poisoned him against his own son. I stayed calm, even though my heart was racing. I visited him because I wanted to. Because he was alone and needed help. You could have visited too, Richard. You chose not to. I live 6 hours away. Richard's voice was rising again. I have a career. I have responsibilities. And Grandpa had needs, I said quietly. Someone had to meet those needs. That someone turned out to be me, not you. Richard's face twisted with fury. You're not getting away with this. I'm hiring the best estate attorneys in the state. I'm going to prove he wasn't in his right mind. I'm going to prove you coerced him. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my photos, and turned the screen toward him. This is from 6 months ago. Grandpa and me at the diner. The day he told me about the will. The timestamp's right there. June 15th, 1:15 p.m. I have 3 years of photos like this, Richard. Timestamps, locations, everything. Plus, I've got video. Richard's eyes narrowed. What video? I pulled up a video file, pressed play. Grandpa's face filled the screen, sitting in his kitchen, looking directly at the camera. This is for Richard, Grandpa's voice said from my phone speaker. Because I know you're going to contest the will. I know you're going to claim I wasn't thinking clearly or that Nathan manipulated me. So I want you to hear this directly from me. I'm leaving everything to Nathan because he was here. You weren't. It's that simple. No manipulation, no coercion. Just a grandfather rewarding the person who actually gave a damn. I paused the video. I've got 20 more minutes of this. Grandpa recorded it the same day he updated the will. He wanted to make sure you couldn't claim undue influence. Richard stared at my phone like it was a snake. You recorded him without his knowledge. I shook my head. He asked me to record him. He wanted documentation. Diane has the full video in her files. I just have a copy. Richard's face went through several expressions, rage to disbelief to defeat, before settling on something cold and calculating. Fine. Take your inheritance. Take everything. But don't expect me to be part of your life. Don't expect family connections. As far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me. I met his eyes. Richard, you haven't been part of my life since I was 12 years old. Neither has Patricia. Neither has Vanessa. You visited twice a year for 4 hours. I'm not losing anything I ever actually had. He flinched like I'd slapped him. Patricia stood up, grabbing her purse. Come on, Richard. We're leaving. We don't have to stay here and listen to this. They walked toward the door. Vanessa followed, still on her phone. Richard stopped at the doorway, turned back. Enjoy your blood money, Nathan. Enjoy living in that old man's house, knowing you stole it from his real family. I stayed calm, kept my voice level. I didn't steal anything. I earned it by showing up. Something you never bothered to do. Richard's jaw clenched. Then he left, Patricia and Vanessa trailing behind him. The door slammed shut. My mother and I sat in the quiet conference room. She looked at me like she'd never seen me before. You could have told me, she said finally, about the will, about visiting him all the time. I shrugged. Would you have believed me? Or would you have told Richard? She didn't answer. We both knew the truth. She would have told Richard. She would have tried to talk Grandpa out of it. That's why I hadn't said anything. We left the funeral home separately. I drove to the farmhouse, my farmhouse now, and sat in the driveway, looking at the building Grandpa had constructed with his own hands over the course of 2 years. The sunset was painting the sky orange and pink behind it. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. Over the next few weeks, Richard made good on his threat. He hired an attorney, a man named Philip Gardner, who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Philip sent me a letter informing me that his client was formally contesting the will on grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. The letter demanded I cease all activity related to the estate and preserve all assets pending legal resolution. I forwarded the letter to Diane. She called me 2 hours later, laughing. They've got nothing, she said. Philip's a good attorney, but he's working with no evidence and a client who looks terrible on paper. I've already drafted our response. Don't worry about this. The case dragged on for 4 months, depositions and filings and legal maneuvering that cost Richard, by my estimate, close to $80,000 in attorney fees. Philip deposed me, Diane, Mrs. Kowalski, George Prentice, Dr. Liu, and 6 other people who'd witnessed my relationship with Grandpa. Every deposition strengthened our case. Mrs. Kowalski testified that I'd visited like clockwork for 3 years. George testified that Grandpa had explicitly told him about changing his will. Dr. Liu testified that Grandpa had been mentally sharp right up until the end. Philip tried to argue that I'd isolated Grandpa from family, but the evidence showed Richard had isolated himself through his own choices. Phone records showed Richard called once a week for approximately 10 minutes, conversations that Grandpa had described in his journal as perfunctory and focused on selling the house. Visit logs showed Richard had visited exactly 6 times in 3 years, each visit lasting under 5 hours. My calendar, by contrast, showed 240 visits over the same period. The math was devastating to Richard's case. 4 months after filing the contest, Philip withdrew it. He sent a letter stating that after thorough investigation, his client was accepting the will as valid and would not pursue further legal action. The letter was professional and brief, but I could read the subtext. They'd realized they couldn't win and were cutting their losses. I inherited everything. The farmhouse became mine officially in March, 9 months after Grandpa's death. The land, the workshop, the equipment, all of it. The liquid assets transferred to an account in my name. I became, overnight, a millionaire, though most of my wealth was tied up in property. I quit my job at Frost & Associates, though Leonard offered me a partnership if I stayed. I thanked him but declined. I had other plans. I spent the next year renovating the farmhouse, updating the kitchen and bathrooms, while keeping the character Grandpa had built into every board. I converted the workshop into a functional carpentry business, Morrison Carpentry, running it the way Grandpa would have wanted. I hired 2 of his old employees who'd been working odd jobs since the business closed. We took on custom projects, built furniture, did restoration work. The business didn't make me rich, but it was profitable, and more importantly, it honored what Grandpa had built. I never heard from Richard again. No phone calls, no letters, nothing. He'd meant what he said about cutting me off. Patricia and Vanessa disappeared from my life too. My mother called occasionally, awkward conversations where she tried to maintain some relationship, but the damage was done. She'd chosen sides at that funeral, and we both knew it. One Sunday afternoon, 2 years after Grandpa's death, I was working in the garden, planting the same bulbs Grandpa and I had planted years before, when Mrs. Kowalski walked over from her property next door. She was carrying a casserole dish and had that look people get when they're about to say something meaningful. Your grandfather would be proud, she said, gesturing at the house, the garden, the property that looked loved and maintained. He always said you were the good one, the one who understood what mattered. I thanked her, wiped dirt off my hands. She handed me the casserole. Chicken pot pie. Your favorite, if I remember right. She'd remembered right. Grandpa had told her. We sat on the porch, the same porch where Grandpa had told me about the will 2 years earlier, and watched the sunset. The storms had passed. The property was mine. The legacy was preserved. And somewhere, I hoped, Grandpa was satisfied with how it had all turned out. Justice hadn't been loud or dramatic. It had been quiet, documented, and absolutely ironclad, just the way he'd planned it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.